Hi guys, it's Reagan and welcome back to another video. Today's video is going to be a tad bit controversial, but in my opinion, these tend to be some of the most fun to film, at least to me, and to watch. That's right, today I'm going to be chatting through some books that I personally think are overhyped, books that just for some reason I constantly see beaming and glowing reviews for, thousands upon thousands of reviews for, and I've read them, and to me, they just didn't live up to my very high expectations. Of course, before we dive into the books themselves, I do want to say this is simply just my opinion. My opinion is not law. In fact, I am happy for you if you enjoyed these books, and I wish I was you, because I truly pick up every book hoping to love it. So when it falls flat, I am very disappointed about it, to be honest. But without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right in, starting with my most recent overhyped read, and that is going to be House of Breath and Sky, Book 2 to the Crescent City series by Sarah J. Maas. I could literally film this entire video just ranting about this particular book, and I am still at a loss, confused, that this book has hundreds of thousands of like 5-star reviews, 4 or 5-star reviews, when this is simply probably one of my lowest rated books in years. And the thing is, I have read a lot of Sarah J. Maas books, and generally I really enjoy them. I go into the sort of romance-centered fantasy story with a certain set of expectations. Like, I don't need a mind-blowing plot. I just want likable characters, a fun, steamy romance, and something to capture and distract me while I'm reading and having a good time. But unfortunately, this book did not deliver in any way, shape, or form. Quick reminder about what this book is about. This is a story set in a place called Crescent City, which is essentially an urban fantasy-esque city that has different sections controlled by different supernatural creatures, from vampires to werewolves to angels and the like. In the beginning of book 1, we run into our main character Bryce, who is a party girl who kind of has a very tragic event occur to her at the beginning of the story. From there, she gets involved in an investigation with an individual named Hunt. They have a very dramatic will they, won't they, hate each other, love each other sort of situation. And for the most part, I enjoyed book 1. I found the romance to be engaging. I found the plot to be fast-paced, and at the end of book 1, I found that the sort of hint to a larger political conspiracy really hooked me. So I was really looking forward to picking up book 2. I thought I was going to love it, but unfortunately it was like a 750-page snooze fest. My main issue with House of Breath and Sky is the pacing. I felt that so little actually happened within this series. The first chapter was incredible. It was action-packed. It hinted at so much. It hinted at rebellion factions and kind of a larger purview into the rebel activities in this area. But then we had 400 pages of the worst investigation I've ever read, and then absolutely no plot payoff. And that just kind of felt like the entire name of the game for this series. Very bloated, poorly paced story that should have had hundreds of pages removed from it, and just simply a very underwhelming plot. On top of that, I did not like the primary romance at all, but usually Sarah J. Maas saves herself by introducing other sub-romantic plot lines that you also fall in love with, but there was just nothing there for me at all, and simply, there was too many male points of view. Like, where were the ladies? Where's the softness? Where's the romance? There was no romance in book 2. Anyway, I'm gonna try to not rant anymore about this book, but this is very fresh on my mind. And ultimately, I found this book to be not very good, and I feel like it's so overhyped. And what's really annoying to me is I will be reading book 3 because I need to know what's going to happen next after that ending. It took 750 pages, or however long this book is. Maybe it's like 800 pages, but the last 20 pages were good. Sarah, what is going on? In a very similar vein, the next book I'm going to be talking about is the second book to the Blood and Ash series by Jennifer L. Armentrout. Another like steamy, fun fantasy romance story. And again, I have really specific expectations when I'm going into this. I'm not trying to have my mind blown. And for the most part, I found the first one, Blood and Ash, to be relatively entertaining. It had a fantasy plot line, by no means mind-blowing, but was interesting. It's kind of like a reimagining of vampires and werewolves, but more in a traditional fantasy setting, which I thought was actually kind of cool. It follows our main character Poppy, who is a maiden, and she's kept aside from everyone in society. She's not allowed to be touched. She's not allowed to have any friends or companionships or anything. But at the beginning of this book, she gets a new guard named Hawk, and they are drawn to each other, and a bunch of dramatic things happen from there. Again, the first one is by no means perfect, but I found it entertaining. But then we move into book 2, which is another bloated, poorly paced second installment in this series. I feel like there is a bit of a trend going on here, and I feel like second books need to be evaluated in this romance fantasy genre. All right, guys. In contrast, I do feel like Sarah J. Maas attempted to give us a plot in House of Sky and Breath versus the sequel to Blood and Ash had none, and I don't even think Jennifer Armentrout was like trying to give us one. Literally, if you break it down, another 600-700 page book where nothing happened. We were just moving from keep to keep to keep, and it was just like a new backdrop for a steamy scene. And again, if that's what wants to be done, I feel like that's absolutely fine, but don't pretend like this is the pinnacle of fantasy plot writing. And in a similar vein, I also feel like there was a stalling in the couple dynamics. I feel like in book one, and for both of these instances, you're really drawn in by the chase, the will they, won't they. So even if you don't love them as a couple, you're still intrigued by the intensity of that. But both of these series struggle in book two when you're just kind of left with two couples that are not very likable at the end of the day, in my point of view. So again, I would say this sequel is very overhyped, and this is a series I don't think I'm going to carry on with. While I was definitely hooked at the end of House of Breath and Sky by Sarah J. Maas, this was not the case for the Blood and Ash series by Jennifer Armentrout. To continue my streak of angering people in different fandoms, the next series I'm going to talk about is the Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. And before you yell at me, I like Jim Butcher's writing. I've actually read the entirety of the Codex Alera, and that is one of my favorite fantasy series from growing up. I enjoy his books, and I've read a lot of his books. And when it comes to the Dresden Files, this is a series I've given the most chances for any book series in my entire life. And this is a series that caused quite a bit of dissonance in me because I want to love it so bad, but it just continually falls flat, and it's for one specific reason, and that is Harry Dresden himself. This is a serialized fantasy sort of detective series, and the strength of the series is in some parts Harry Dresden himself. He's like a wizard, and he's basically solving different paranormal magical crimes around the greater Chicago area. Each book has a pretty interesting kind of mystery plot line. The magic and the problem solving is always interesting to learn about, as well as the creature and fantasy lore that Jim Butcher does write. That being said, the worst part about this series is also Harry Dresden. He is the most obnoxious male point of view character I have ever voluntarily read from in my entire life. His just constant dialogue about the women in his life is awful. Not to mention all of the female side characters are so limited in their scope and personality. They're so two-dimensional, and every time I'm starting to like Harry Dresden, he sees a hot lady and just his entire monologue about it just immediately pulls me out of the story. I personally find it incredibly distracting. Again, absolutely no hate if you love this series. And honestly, again, I would love to love it. And I've heard a lot of people say that it gets better after book 4 or book 5. But I've also heard like even in later, much later installments, Harry Dresden continues to do the same thing. And I've already read 4 books in this series. And I feel like that should be kind of enough of a chance to decide if something is worth your time. But yes, this series and me just does not connect. I personally think it is overhyped. I don't know how people can love Harry Dresden because he seems so nice guy insufferable to me. The next overhyped book on my list is Serpent and Dove. On the surface, I would say this series houses a lot of my favorite types of tropes, from marriage of convenience to enemies to lovers, but I do feel like the execution of this book is just not fantastic. It's by no means an awful book, but it's also by no means a fantastic book. And that is kind of where I lie with this series. It's mostly just, I feel like if you want really good YA fantasy with a strong romantic plotline, there are better series to turn to than this one. This is a fantasy world where witches exist and also witch hunters exist. They're trying to kill the witches. At the beginning of this book, a witch marries a witch hunter, and it's all very dramatic from there. Here's the thing, while I do feel like some aspects of the relationships were well written in my opinion, I struggled with the fantasy element. I just felt like the backstory development, the magic system, just the context and overview of the entire fantasy portion of this book was just not very well developed. And for that reason, I do feel like this book series is overhyped, mostly again because there's just better options out there. If you want romantic tension, enemies to lover, and good fantasy, so many options in the YA genre, people. In a similar vein, I also have to mention These Violent Delights. This is a duology I so wanted to love, and this is also a series that is by no means bad. I also just think it's okay. But this is a series I also feel like is constantly topping like my favorite YA fantasy lists and things, and I just simply Disagree. Obviously, if you love it, absolutely nothing wrong with it. The thing with These Violent Delights is that it actually has an amazing concept. The idea of the story is that it's a historical fiction novel set in Shanghai during the 20s, and it's a Romeo and Juliet retelling about two rival gang heirs falling in love and the romantic tension between them over the course of two novels. I will say Chloe Gong had a lot of strength creating this sort of very toxic but also very addicting romance in this book. And I also feel like the setting and the idea of this story was very strong, like conceptually speaking, like such a good idea. But unfortunately, elements of the execution just fell a bit flat for me. Normally, I feel like I would complain about a book being slow, but in this case, I actually felt like the book moved too quickly. There was a lot of intense scenes, but because I almost felt like they were there and gone so fast, I wasn't given a lot of time to kind of sit with them and actually take on the emotional impact of what I was reading. I really loved a lot of the characters within this series. I found the historical setting to be very interesting and really fleshed out, as well as the gang elements to be very, very cool. That being said, this really contrasted the fantasy component, which ultimately I never really felt was fully realized. Like, it never felt fully like tangible and exactly what the author wanted to do. I also felt it got a little bit repetitive, and the actual build up to the fantasy reveal of it all, this sort of parasite moment, just ultimately didn't entirely work out for me. That being said, this is a debut series, and I do feel like there was strong enough elements where I'll for sure be checking out other books by Chloe Gong, because I have a feeling each book is just going to get better and better, and her ideas are great. It's really just some elements of the execution. And again, this series is by no means bad. I think it's like a solid 3-star read. I just picked it up hoping it would be like a new 5-star YA fantasy favorite, and it ended up just kind of underwhelming me when I finished reading it recently. The next book I feel like shouldn't be too much of a surprise. It was for sure one of my least favorite books of last year and just one of my most disappointing reads in general. I had set high expectations going in, and the author is so famous that I was just really hoping to love it and then possibly check out other books that he has released, and that is To Sleep in a Sea of Stars by Christopher Paolini. This is a space opera story that basically follows our main character, who in the beginning of the book stumbles upon an ancient alien technology which kind of takes the form of this like super suit situation. From there, we follow her and a crew of a ship kind of jumping from place to place, both trying to dodge aliens, trying to recapture this technology, and just general outright war that is broken out within the system. On the surface, this book sounds really interesting, but again, the execution just wasn't entirely there for me. This is another book that I feel like really suffered with pacing. Again, I just feel like a lot of editing could have been done to make this book more successful. I feel like Christopher Paolini was going for this really fast-paced, high-octane, like can't put this book down, intense sci-fi story, but unfortunately, I actually found it to be very repetitive. I really felt like so many of the conflicts we encountered in this story just felt like copy and paste of previous conflicts we had just read. And with this repetition, I just felt like it kept compounding on each other over and over and over again, where ultimately I just got bored. Another book that's like 800 pages long that should have had hundreds of pages cut out of it, and I really think it would have served the book well. And because I found the plot to be a little boring, I also found the characters, which I might have been able to overlook as being a little two-dimensional if the plot was really engaging, to also begin to bother me as well. Christopher Paolini tried his hand at writing a female character, and it just didn't feel so real. And I could say the same with a lot of the characters in this book. They just didn't feel fully realized as characters, and they felt kind of like parts being played in. But yeah, this is a book that just ultimately was too long, too boring, not great characters, and was just overall a very big disappointment. A very hyped up book that just very much let me down. Next is a book that might be a bit of a surprise. I feel like this book is so beloved, and I see it everywhere, topping like best fantasy reads I've ever read kind of videos, and that is Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. Here's the deal. I love Samantha Shannon's writing, and I actually think large parts of this book were very, very strong, but I went into this book expecting it to be like one of my new favorite fantasy books for the rest of time, and simply I was left just wanting more. And to kind of break that down a bit further, Priory of the Orange Tree is a fantasy standalone, and I feel like a lot is said about how long it is and how it's like such a thick fantasy read, but in my opinion, when I read this book, I actually wanted it to be longer, like well into the 1,000 page mark, or even 2 700 page books, because I just needed more development from the story. In fact, I actually found the first 75% of this book to be super well written, engaging, cool characters, these different kingdoms that were really well fleshed out, and the political reality of these different places really being explored, and this sort of great evil force that's threatening everyone around us was really well developed to not only create intensity, but also anticipation. Which leads me to the last 25% of this book, where I was entirely let down. We had so much buildup, we had so much world building, and the ending was like 5 seconds long. I felt like we spent so much time in these places and with these characters and with this evil force that we knew we had to confront, and then it was over like instantaneously. And it was almost shocking. Like I felt like I had whiplash reading this book, because so much of it I was like, 5 stars, loved it, loved it, loved it. And then the ending was like a 1-2 star moment. I needed this book to be longer. I needed more development to get the rich payoff of all that time we spent leading up to this moment, because it was there. And this is a book that like hurts me, because it was so close, and I just needed more from it. And I'm very disappointed that I didn't love it as much as everyone else, but I really feel like it could have been so good. And Priory of the Orange Tree like almost makes me a little mad every time I stare at it. But a lot of people love this book, and I can understand why, because most of it is fantastic, but I do feel like the ending was way too rushed, and I'm curious if anyone else feels the same way as me. And the very last book I'm going to chat about that I think is overhyped also hurts my soul, and that is Kings of the Wild. This is like a cult favorite. I picked this book up really honestly thinking I was going to love it just based on the synopsis alone. I love a jaunty quest story. I love like funny and fun fantasy books, but ultimately I just found the characterization in this just not for me. This is another book, if it sounds at all interesting to you, like many of the books I talked about in this video, I would still recommend reading and checking out, because obviously what I think is overhyped might be your next favorite read. Reading is so subjective like that. Kings of the Wild as a concept just sounded so fun. The idea is like getting the band back together. It follows a group of mercenaries who have retired, but when our main character's daughter kind of goes on her own quest and he is concerned that she is in danger, he brings back all of the guys to go on one last quest in hopes of saving her. From there, you kind of see them go through all these different trials and tribulations, visit all these different places. It's humorous and fun. It's also very self-aware. It kind of has like a D&D vibe, which also, like, if you like quest stories, this could be a new favorite. But for me, it's like, I thought it was just good. It was not great. It was not amazing. I feel like so many people give this book 5 stars. If you look at the Goodreads rating, it's incredibly high. And unfortunately for me, it just felt like a 3-star read. And when you want a book to be a 5-star read, nothing is more disappointing when it's just good, like not even bad enough to hate it, but a read where you're just like, I don't even have that many strong opinions about it, but I didn't love it, I didn't hate it, I just thought it was okay. And I think what it boils down to and why I thought it was just okay is that I never really felt fully connected to the characters in this one either. And I feel like when you have kind of a quirky quest style story, loving and being invested in the humor and the relationships and the banter of the group of characters you're following is incredibly important, but I just never felt that chemistry with them. They always felt a little like separated from me. I never felt fully committed to their points of view. They didn't really have this level of tangibleness that I was looking for. But again, this is seriously a book I would say give it a try if you're interested, especially because in this case, I feel like I'm just wrong, but I can't help it. It's how I feel at the end of the day. Alrighty guys, those are some books that I personally think are overhyped. Please let me know down below some books you think are not worth all the praise they get, as I would love to know. And again, a quick reminder, this is just my opinion. No need to yell at me too much in the comments. Obviously, if you disagree, let me know, but let's keep it cordial. You know what I mean? But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you soon with another one soon. Goodbye.